They thought she was just another quiet officer in name, lost among hundreds of decorated soldiers. But when she stood in the grand hall, without a smile, without a word, I turned to her. What they didn't know was that beneath that uniform lay scars far deeper than any medal could honor. And in a single moment she made an entire system fall silent. The Grand Hall of the United States Naval Operations Command shimmered under layers of polished brass and silent reverence. Cameras clicked from the corners, press tags flashing like insects. But the weight of the moment wasn't in the flashbulbs, it was in the silence. Among the rows of white uniforms and starched medals sat Admiral Raymond Sloan, a man who had seen more than most would dare imagine. Combat, failure, heroism all filtered through the calculating mind of a man who hadn't cried since 1982. His fingers tapped once on the armrest as the announcer's voice echoed over the speakers. For extraordinary valor under direct hostile fire during Operation Lancer Deep, the Navy Cross is hereby awarded to Lieutenant Sarah Whitmore. The name struck the air like a hush falling across a church. Admiral Sloan blinked slowly. That name Sarah Whitmore, he'd heard it whispered in command rooms, spoken only behind closed doors. A ghost of an operation that had been buried and sealed tight. He leaned forward in his seat. From the third row, a woman rose. She wasn't what they expected. No beaming pride, no parade smile. Just a quiet presence wrapped in formal blues. Her short-cropped hair revealed a scar behind her left ear. Her gait was too straight, as if every step was an act of discipline. Not pride, not joy, just necessity. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't wave. She walked to the stage like she was returning to the battlefield. Any applause? It was hesitant, reverent. Like the audience wasn't sure if they should celebrate her or grieve something they couldn't quite name. Admiral Sloan stood. Up close, he noticed her hands. No polish, no trembling. Just skin calloused, precise. Her salute was flawless. Lieutenant Whitmore, he said quietly, pinning the Navy Cross to her jacket. Thank you, sir, she replied, just as quietly. But her eyes, they didn't shine with pride. They were deep, hollowed, as if some part of her had never left wherever she had been 2 years ago. The crowd clapped again. Cameras flashed. She didn't flinch. She turned and walked off the stage without waiting for permission. Later, as the ceremony dissolved into mingling and laughter and champagne glasses clinking, Sarah stood alone in the back near a wall of portraits, all fallen officers. She studied them like old ghosts. That's when Admiral Sloan approached. Lieutenant, he said, stopping beside her. She saluted without looking. At ease. Walk with me. A pause. She glanced at him. Just a flicker. Then nodded. They moved down a quiet hallway lined with plaques and polished glass cases. It felt like a museum of past glories. Sloan spoke first. You refused this medal once. I did, sir. Why accept it now? For a long moment, she said nothing. Her eyes found a portrait of a young Marine. His smile was full of life. Because I didn't think anyone would ever ask why. Sloan slowed his steps. I read your file, he said. Impressive, but sanitized. They don't lie, she murmured. They just leave things out. He stopped. You think something was left out? Sarah turned to him fully now. Her voice was soft, but hard-edged. Sir, we were sent into a jungle with no intel, no support, and no way out. You believe the mission was compromised? I don't believe it. I know it. Silence. Long, weighty. Then she said the words that cracked through his spine. If you really want to understand, you need to see what it actually cost. She glanced toward a secure door at the end of the hall, the kind only officers with clearance could open. Come with me, she said. Inside the room, it was sterile. White walls, 2 chairs, a table. No rank, no noise, no press. Sloan stood by the door, unsure. Sarah walked to the center of the room and placed both hands flat on the table. I haven't been in this room since my debrief. He didn't interrupt. She turned around, and slowly, with measured control, she unbuttoned her jacket. Beneath, her undershirt hugged her form. She lifted it just enough. Sloan froze. Across her right side were deep, brutal scars. Not surgical, not clean, twisted tissue, torn muscle. Near her ribs, 2 small, raised lumps. They're still in me, she said. Shrapnel. Too close to the lungs to remove. He swallowed. You live with that every day, bake during storms. Sometimes I forget they're there, until I see people clapping. The Admiral sat down, slower than usual. He'd seen bullet wounds, burns, but this was different. Sarah lowered her shirt, buttoned her uniform again. I didn't want to medal for surviving something I was never supposed to. I want someone to admit that we were sent into a trap. You think someone knew? He asked cautiously. I know someone did. They sent us in anyway. Another pause, then buried it. The room fell quiet again. She sat across from him. I never cared about glory. I cared about my team. 3 men died in that jungle. 2 more live with injuries that'll never heal. And I got metal inside me that reminds me every morning that someone decided we were expendable. Admiral Sloan stared at her, the weight of her words pressing on his chest. She leaned in. You want to know the truth? You're holding it in this room. He didn't speak, but in that silence something cracked. A system had failed, but the woman sitting before him hadn't. And that was only the beginning. Admiral Raymond Sloan sat back in his chair, still trying to process what Lieutenant Sarah Whitmore had just revealed. Her words weighed on him heavier than any classified file he had ever signed. In his decades of service, he had learned that silence often hid more truth than the loudest reports. And here she was calm, steady, not demanding, not begging, just telling him the raw truth, as if every syllable had been carved into her by fire. You want me to dig into this? He finally asked. Sarah's gaze didn't waver. I want the truth to matter again, sir. I want someone to admit we were more than just pawns in someone's test game. Something inside Sloan tightened. He was known for being unshakable, but now, with this woman's scars burned into his mind, he felt the cracks forming. The following day, Sarah reported for her routine duties. To the outside world, nothing had changed. She trained new recruits, issued commands on the shooting range, corrected stances and salutes. If anyone saw the pain in her movements, they didn't dare ask. But behind her quiet professionalism, whispers were starting to spread. Recruits noticed the way she never boasted about her medal. Officers noticed how the Admiral himself watched her with an unusual intensity, as though she carried a truth no one else could handle. One afternoon, while the younger cadets were doing field drills, a boyish recruit named Palmer, barely 21, approached her with the wide-eyed curiosity of someone who didn't know better. Ma'am, he stammered, is it true what they say about the jungle mission? Sarah looked at him for a long second. What do they say? That you carried 3 men for miles, that you didn't even cry. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I cried, she said softly, just not where anyone could see it. Palmer's face flushed with shame, as if he'd intruded on something sacred. Sarah clapped him lightly on the shoulder and turned back to the training field. She wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being turned into a legend when all she wanted was for the truth to surface. That night, in his private office, Admiral Sloan reopened the file on Operation Lancerdeep. The words were clinical, cold, sterile. Successful extraction, minimal casualties. Officer Whitmore showed exceptional bravery under hostile conditions. Minimal casualties. The phrase made his stomach churn. With a frown, he called Naval Intelligence. I want every communication log, every satellite feed, every piece of data connected to Operation Lancerdeep, he said firmly. No redactions. Sir, that operation was classified and closed 2 years ago. Reopen it. I'm authorizing it under my command. If anyone has a problem, they can talk to me. The next day, he found Sarah waiting outside his office. You're not one for small talk, are you? He asked, gesturing for her to come in. I heard you've been asking questions, she said, taking a seat without waiting for permission. Are you worried? Sloan asked. No, I just want to make sure you're asking the right ones. He studied her for a long moment. There was no fear in her eyes, just resolve. The kind he had only seen in soldiers who'd lost everything and kept standing anyway. I'm starting to think, he said slowly, that this isn't just about the ambush. She leaned forward. It's not. What then? Sarah hesitated, then said, the mission wasn't what they told us it was. We weren't sent there to rescue anyone. We were bait. Sloan's brow furrowed. Bait? For what? Testing, she replied. Weapons, surveillance, I don't know which. But they knew exactly where we'd land. The enemy didn't stumble on us. They were waiting. Later that evening, Sloan invited her to a secure conference room. It was just the 2 of them. A single folder lay on the table thick with reports, timestamps, and intercepted communications. "Here's what I've found," he began, sliding the folder toward her. "There's a 40-minute gap between a distress signal intercepted near your drop zone and the time your team was deployed. That signal was scrubbed from all official logs. Someone went back and altered the timestamps." Sarah's face hardened. "So they knew?" "Yes," Sloan said quietly. "And they sent you in anyway." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the low hum of the overhead lights. Sarah ran her fingers along the edge of the folder, her mind pulling her back into the jungle, the smell of damp earth, the screams of her team, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. "They used us," she whispered, like we were expendable test subjects." Sloan's jaw tightened. "Not on my watch. Not anymore." The shift in power was subtle but palpable. Sloan was no longer just an admiral curious about a soldier's scars. He was becoming her ally. And with every page he uncovered, Sarah's quiet strength began to take shape in a new light. She wasn't just surviving. She was holding the Navy accountable in a way no one dared to. A week later, a private meeting was called. A handful of high-ranking officers gathered in a secure briefing room. Most had never seen Lieutenant Whitmore outside of rumors, but when she walked in, the room fell silent. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Her presence alone demanded respect. Admiral Sloan introduced her with only a few words. "Lieutenant Whitmore has information that changes everything we thought we knew about Operation Lancer Deep." Sarah stepped forward. Her voice was even almost too calm. "I won't give you a speech," she said. "I'll give you the truth." And then, without hesitation, she raised her hand to the buttons of her uniform jacket. Gasps rippled across the room as she pulled it open just enough to show the jagged scars along her ribs, the hard metal lumps that had been fused in her body by fire and shrapnel. "These," she said, "are what your reports leave out. 2 pieces of metal are still inside me because someone decided our lives were acceptable collateral damage." The room went still. A commander shifted uncomfortably. Another officer looked away. Admiral Sloan watched the faces around him, noting who flinched, who froze, and who avoided eye contact entirely. "This isn't about me," Sarah continued. "It's about the truth. And it's time you all decided which side of it you're standing on." For the first time in years, a woman who had once been treated like a ghost was now the most powerful voice in the room. The silence in the briefing room lingered long after Sarah Whitmore had lowered her shirt and buttoned her uniform again. The weight of what she had shown them, what she had lived through, settled like smoke that no one could fan away. Admiral Sloan, standing tall at the head of the table, looked each officer in the eye, daring them to dismiss what they had just witnessed. Finally, it was Vice Admiral Harold Penrose who spoke, his voice flat, almost dismissive. "Lieutenant, I don't see how these injuries constitute evidence of anything beyond battlefield misfortune. War has casualties. That's nothing new." Sarah's gaze locked onto him. "This wasn't war, sir. This was betrayal." The words cut through the air. No one moved. A young commander, seated at the far end of the table, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing nervously between Sloan and Penrose. "What exactly are you implying, Lieutenant?" Penrose asked, leaning forward with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That the mission I led into the jungle wasn't compromised by accident," Sarah replied evenly. "Someone placed us exactly where the enemy was waiting. We were never meant to come back." A low murmur rolled across the table. Some of the officers leaned in. Others recoiled as if she'd said something dangerous. "And how can you be so certain?" Penrose pressed. Sarah reached into the folder she had brought, pulling out several printed documents. She laid them out with precise movements, one after another. Decrypted satellite path records, unaltered timestamps, and a memo she wasn't supposed to have. "This," she said, tapping the first page, "is a transmission between Orion Systems, a private defense contractor, and a Navy relay node. It contains a field ID code that matches our mission. It was sent 11 hours before we deployed." Penrose's smile faltered. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter?" Sarah asked. "Or are you more concerned about clearance than the fact that it proves we were being tracked long before we touched the ground?" Admiral Sloan stepped in, his voice firm. "She's not wrong, Harold. I've already had naval intelligence verify parts of this data. Something doesn't add up, and it's not going to be swept under the rug this time." The room went quiet again. Penrose shifted in his seat, his confidence slipping. "These are accusations, not facts," he muttered. "Then let's find the facts," Sloane said coldly. "If someone inside our chain of command knowingly sent a recon team into a death trap to test a piece of technology, that's not just a mistake, that's treason." A junior officer at the table, Commander Raina Coburn from Naval Intelligence, cleared her throat. "Admiral Sloane, with your authorization, I can open a preliminary criminal investigation. There's enough here to justify it." Penrose glared at her. "You'll destroy careers with speculation." Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady but edged with fire. "3 of my men are dead because someone decided their lives were disposable. I don't care about careers. I care about the truth." The room froze. Even Penrose, for all his bluster, couldn't find a quick retort. Later that evening, as the officers dispersed, Sloane remained behind with Sarah. The heavy oak doors of the briefing room clicked shut, leaving them in a silence that felt both victorious and dangerous. "You know this makes you a target," Sloane said, his tone low. Sarah shrugged slightly. "I've been a target since the day I crawled out of that jungle." He studied her, the glint of respect now undeniable in his eyes. "You could have walked away. You could have taken the medal, smiled for the cameras, and never spoken about this again." "And let them do it to someone else?" she asked. "No, sir. If they're willing to sacrifice one team, they'll do it again. I won't let that happen." The following week, the scandal began to crack open from the inside. A secure internal audit revealed that the scientist Sarah's team was supposed to rescue DR. Tomas Vera had been dead before they even deployed. The extraction mission was a fabricated cover. The real objective? Live field data collection for Orion Systems' prototype drone tracking algorithm. Sarah sat across from Sloane as he read the report out loud, his jaw tightening with every sentence. "They didn't just set you up," Sloane muttered. "They lied to all of us. They turned us into lab rats," Sarah said, her voice flat. "And when things went wrong, they handed me a medal to keep me quiet." Sloane slammed the folder shut. "Not anymore." The climax came during a high-level, closed-door inquiry. Sarah was called to testify in front of senior Navy officials and defense liaisons. Word of her story had already circulated, but few had believed it until she walked into the room and placed her scars, her data, and her voice on record. The tension was electric. Every word she spoke dismantled the carefully built narrative that Orion Systems and their allies in command had spun. One of the civilian contractors shifted uneasily, realizing that the lie was no longer airtight. "Lieutenant Whitmore," a panel officer said, "you're implying that high-ranking officials knowingly sanctioned a mission they knew would fail." "I'm not implying," Sarah said. "I'm stating it. And I'm standing here because I refuse to let their silence bury my team." The room fell into a heavy hush. Some officers looked down at their hands. Others stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. Outside the inquiry chamber, Sloane caught up to her. "They're rattled," he said, almost smiling. Penrose looked like he'd swallowed a grenade. Sarah didn't smile. "It's not about rattling them. It's about making sure no one else walks into a mission like that again." "And you think they'll listen?" Sloane asked. She looked up at him, her eyes hard but not hopeless. "They have to, because now everyone knows I'm not staying quiet." For the first time, Admiral Sloane realized something profound. Sarah wasn't just fighting for justice, she was redefining what courage meant in a system built on silence. The inquiry had concluded, but its aftershocks rippled far beyond the closed walls of the Naval Command building. Within days, the story began to seep through defense channels. Orion Systems was under investigation, and several high-ranking officials were placed on administrative leave. While the press only caught whispers of internal reviews, within the Navy, everyone knew one thing. Lieutenant Sarah Whitmore was no longer a ghost. One crisp morning, Sarah walked across the base, the autumn wind tugging gently at her uniform jacket. A small group of cadets stood outside the officers' mess, their posture straight as she passed. One of them, barely 20, saluted nervously. "Ma'am," he said, his voice trembling with sincerity, "thank you for not letting them bury the truth." Sarah paused. Her throat tightened for a second, but she managed a soft nod. "We don't serve just to wear medals," she said quietly. "We serve to protect each other." As she walked away, She felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, not rooted in orders or protocols, but in the clarity of knowing she had fought for what mattered. Later that afternoon, she was summoned to Admiral Sloane's office. The sunlight spilled across his desk, illuminating a sealed folder. He stood by the window, his posture as firm as ever, but his expression held something warmer now. "I have news," he said, handing her the folder. She opened it carefully. Inside was a redeployment request, but it wasn't combat. It was an advisory post attached to a newly formed Defense Ethics and Field Integrity Task Force. She would have a voice, not just in the field, but in shaping how missions were approved, reviewed, and monitored. "You want me to fix the system?" she asked, her tone skeptical but not unkind. Sloane shook his head. "I want you to help rebuild it. Because if people like you don't lead, the wrong people will." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then glanced down at the papers again. "I nearly died in that jungle, Admiral. 3 men did die. This system almost broke me. That's why I need someone who's been through it," Sloane said firmly. "Someone who knows what real sacrifice looks like and won't let them forget." That night, Sarah visited Sergeant Malik Hayes, her closest surviving teammate from Operation Lancer Deep. They met outside a small veterans center, the kind with faded flags and quiet benches. Malik's limp was more pronounced now, and his scarred hand shook slightly when he clasped hers. "I saw the hearings," he said with a grin that didn't hide the emotion in his eyes. "You were a force of nature." Sarah chuckled softly. "I just told the truth." "You did more than that," he replied. "You made them listen. You made it mean something." She handed him a copy of her statement. "This is everything. Every lie, every thread I could pull." Malik looked down at the papers, his jaw tightening. "You still carry it, don't you? Every day." Sarah didn't deny it. "Yes, but I'm learning to carry it like armor, not a burden." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the evening light fade. It wasn't the silence of pain anymore, but of understanding. Weeks later, Sarah boarded a flight to Washington, D.C. This time, she wasn't being sent into the unknown. She was going to sit at the table where decisions were made. At the Pentagon, she met with Defense Secretary Langston, a blunt man who didn't waste words. "We've built too much policy around technology and profit," he said, eyeing her scars as if they were part of the agenda. "We need voices like yours, real honesto, keep us from losing our humanity." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then let's start by remembering the cost of silence." 6 months passed. The reforms she pushed for known informally as the Whitmore Clause became a turning point in operational ethics. Private contractors were no longer allowed to override on-ground commanders. Field officers gained direct channels to report unsafe protocols. And for the first time in years, soldiers felt like they weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. Sarah remained visible but humble. She didn't chase interviews, didn't bask in recognition. Instead, she visited veteran hospitals, bringing chessboards and poetry books, speaking quietly to soldiers who felt forgotten. One young amputee asked her, "Ma'am, do you ever feel like you didn't make it back home?" Sarah looked at him with a soft smile. "I didn't, but I came back with something more important, proof that surviving isn't the end of your story. It's where you start speaking." On the anniversary of Operation Lancer Deep, Sarah and Malik returned to the jungle site with a small memorial team. The terrain had been reclaimed by nature, but the memory of that night still hung in the damp air. They planted a flag, said the names of their fallen teammates, and stood in silence. "Think you'll ever stop fighting?" Malik asked quietly. Sarah shook her head, eyes steady. "Not as long as someone out there still thinks silence is safer than the truth." Months later, she was invited to speak at the U.S. Naval Academy. The auditorium was packed rows of crisp uniforms, eyes fixed on her. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. "You'll hear about glory," she began, her voice carrying through the hall. "You'll hear about sacrifice. But what they won't always tell you is how to survive the weight of what you lose and how to speak when you're told to stay silent." She paused, placing a hand over the scars hidden beneath her uniform. "This," she said, "was meant to be forgotten, but it became the loudest part of my story. I stand here not because I was the strongest, but because I refused to let fear decide when I could speak. You won't always be believed, but speak anyway. The ones who matter will hear you." The hall erupted in applause, thunderous, heartfelt, unshaken. That night, Admiral Sloane called her. "You did it," he said simply. Sarah looked at the reflection of her scars in the hotel mirror. No, she murmured. We did it. And this is just the beginning. Greatness doesn't wear loud colors or demand applause. It walks quietly, scars and all, and lets the truth speak louder than the silence of fear. Never underestimate the power of a single voice that refuses to be ignored.